I'm supposed to talk really fast, right? Is it not the deal? Okay, so this is a project. There are some behavioral aspects to it, but I want to oversell the behavioral aspects. This is actually primarily motivated as an approach that is fairly common in America. Millions of households that are low income, do not have access to good credit, are promoted what's called credit builder loans. Here's what a credit builder loan is. We worked with the St. Louis Community Credit Union. It's $600 loan proceeds. I put loan in double quotes because when you hear this, you're going to be like, huh, that's weird. You get $600. Those $600 go into a savings account at the bank. You don't get to take the money out. Every month you make a $50 payment, 50 times 12, 600. You also pay $4 a month on top of the 50. So you've now paid $48 in interest on your loan. And at the end of that period, you can pull out your $600. You can also pull out a little money along the way, but only as you pay in. Okay, so primarily, here's the kicker. This is called a loan from the credit bureaus. The credit bureaus say this is a loan. They're trying to build, this is the best link I'm going to give to Katie and Angela, this is trying to build habits of good repayments of loans, and this is why the credit bureaus say they consider this a loan. And they score it as a loan, it goes into your credit system as a loan. They also will often say that it's kind of like, hey, we're trying to build a habit of making payments and savings. And this is where when I presented this once in front of my daughter, when she was about 13, she said, Dad, this sounds like a commitment savings account with a negative interest rate. And I was like, good, I trained her well. And so there is that kind of secondary goal. So if you Google these things, you will see they're promoted in a lot of cases from like consumer watchdog, money bloggers, things like that, as like a good way of helping to get on the on-ramp. So here's what we did. We're down to 6 minutes. This is the abbreviated version. That's the brochure. We did a discouragement design. This is a little side point. Financial education, great discouragement, friction. It's like an anti-nudge basically. I wouldn't quite call it a sludge, but it's more of an anti-nudge, and that we used it as actually created a friction that is actually a public policy, and it created lower take-up of the product. And that was the randomized trial. The bank requires this for some people, and of course nobody did it, and so it dropped the participation in the control group relative to the treatment group. We do find there's a lot of delinquency. The credit builder loan had 42%. The extra step were the people who had the financial education. They also had some default of the people who adopted. So some people do this and they don't actually make the monthly payments, right? And so what do we find? We find no average treatment effect. Fortunately, we do have some more interesting things to say beyond this doesn't work, which in itself is actually a really important result given how well it is promoted. What we find is there's huge heterogeneity, and it's everything we did, we could not beat down this one way of slicing it was, did they have loans already at baseline? When they started this, were they anywhere on the on-ramp already? And as you can see, for the top row are the people who had no access, no loans, basically, nothing at baseline. And they're better off. They're more likely to have a credit score now before, like they actually have a score versus not. And their credit score did go up a little bit, not significant statistically. The people who had a loan, they actually did worse. The average of a positive negative, in this case, averaged out to 0, hence the 0 average treatment effect. We do find that this is, I'll skip this for the 6-minute version, but basically it's not driven by everything else we know about people. So we tried beating down that heterogeneity to see if there's other things that we could use to predict that heterogeneity. Nothing else worked. That kind of lasted and persisted, telling us that there was something about just having too much on them that they were unable to handle the extra loans, basically. Importantly, the selection effects are there, right? There's a reason why these are reported in a very simplistic, non-randomized trial kind of evaluative process. If you take a look at the people who took out these products, they do on average do much better. That's all this is telling us, is that if you take up the loan compared to before, your results go up. Right? And that's what the bloggers report, that's what the consumer watchdog, that's what the industry reports. Hey, do this, and we see 40 percentage point gains in 40-point gain in your credit score. And that's just before after, and that's telling you entirely about selection, because we know there's no average treatment effect now. And so that's what this slide is just looking at the treatment analysis before to after. Okay, so now when we first tackled this project, we were thinking about it partly from the consumer perspective. Is this a good product for people to help improve their credit score? I am an economist. So I do want to know, not just did it help people, but I want to know whether that's good for markets. Because if we take a bunch of people who have low credit scores and we kind of manufacture a way for them to get better credit scores, I might be really happy as kind of a behavioral scientist in that I help them do better and get a better credit score. But I'm actually not happy as an economist who cares about efficient markets if I just took a bunch of people who actually should have a bad credit score, and that's actually the accurate representation of their credit risk. And now they're faking a better credit score, and that's monkeying markets, and then lenders won't lend to anybody because they don't know whether they can trust the credit scores anymore. And so, another way of asking this question is, does the product actually change behavior and change habits, or is it actually just correcting a misalignment in a credit score where there was people who had bad credit scores who really are better, or is it actually worsening the quality of the credit score? And in short, we find no change in the predictive power of the credit score. Now it's a weak test, we'll admit, because we only have the landscape of our kind of 12 months of the study where we see a shift to go. I was supposed to get a bell when I had 5 minutes left. You didn't give me a bell.
You have 5 seconds.
So you said bell and I had 5 more minutes. Okay, so bottom line, the implications are this works, but it should be targeted to people without loans. And then we really need to think like behavioral scientists and think, okay, for the people who were made worse off for this, what's going wrong? How do you morph this product to help them more, help them deal with the multiple obligations that were making this do badly for them?
Hi everyone, the title of my talk is Taking Contextual Heterogeneity Seriously in Behavior Change Research. So in 2013, Maya Shankar and I hosted a meeting at the White House on mindset research. The event started with Maya's question about whether research on growth mindset, which is the idea that people's intelligence is not fixed but can change, would be ready for implementation in education reform at a national level. This is important because there's a cultural belief system in which intelligence is fixed and that it can in some ways be an impediment for motivation and learning. The burning question that the attendees all agreed we needed to answer at that time was, could our growth mindset interventions plausibly improve educational outcomes on a national scale? And so we launched the National Study of Learning Mindsets, which is an RCT evaluating an adolescent behavior change intervention in a nationally representative sample. But as I sat down to develop the study plan, I realized that the very nature of this question reflects a deeply entrenched oversimplification in the way that our field tends to think about behavioral interventions. We are studying things that depend on context. And our approach as behavioral scientists, of course, tends to focus almost exclusively on the psychology that drives individual choices, but that ignores the fact, often emphasized by sociologists, that agency is constrained by opportunities and affordances in the context. And this creates problems because if we're fortunate enough that people are using our work in the wild, they need to know that they're dependent on context, or else they're going to be disappointed when they don't find the main effects that our public communications about the treatments often communicate. So I've become convinced that the only way for the field to move forward is to ask a different question, one that privileges context. And this began a 6-year journey of learning and collaboration that I'm excited to share with you today. The question is, in which kinds of schools would a growth mindset not work and why? Answering this doesn't just help us learn about the mechanisms for intervention effects, it'll also bolster our credibility when it comes to using behavioral science as a policy tool. However, historically, the field has been unprepared to definitively answer questions about treatment effect heterogeneity. We all know you can't meta-analyze your way out of a body of research that was designed to find average effects in haphazard samples. So we needed a study that was designed from the ground up to yield replicable and generalizable insights about contextual sources of heterogeneity. And to do that, we had to form a team and pull together and invent methods that had never been combined before in a single study. That's the National Study of Learning Mindsets. Here are some of the methodological features of the study. There's two I want to point out. One is that we oversampled schools expected to show smaller effects. And this is the kind of thing you do if you're serious about detecting interaction effects. But it's not the kind of thing you would do if you're designing studies to tout the largest possible main effects in the media or in our journals. Second, I want to emphasize that the rather complicated subgroup effects I'll present are normally a red flag for post hoc data snooping. but everything I'm about to show you is from a pre-registered and vetted analysis that limited ourselves to only 2 moderators and was confirmed in a blinded confirmatory Bayesian causal force analysis. That's pretty neat, and it's freely available. What we did is we looked at the effect of a 1-hour online growth mindset treatment at the beginning of 9th grade on the percent of students earning GPAs in the D or F range, which is a pre-registered outcome because failing to complete 9th grade on track for graduation is a key predictor of labor market outcomes, which is to say policymakers care about it. The average effect among lower achieving students, which is the group we targeted, in part because we thought students who always have A's are unlikely to fail, which was true. The average effect for low achievers was 5 percentage points, and 3 percentage points overall in the sample, both significant. This is among the largest effects for this outcome of any intervention of any size, duration, or cost. It's also rather cost effective, but it's also important to note this is the only effect size to appear in a representative sample. Now, standard practice is that I would show you results like this, and that would be the end of the talk. But that would be a huge wasted opportunity, I think, after collecting such a rich data set. Or as my statistician friend said, that would be a very expensive t-test. So luckily, our main goal here is to learn about heterogeneity. The 2 pre-registered moderators were driven by close consultation with sociologists who spent a lot of time thinking about the role of context in shaping education. First, we examined structural opportunities. Does a school already have such strong safety nets that kids with a fixed mindset are unlikely to fail their courses? And as predicted, the highest achieving schools didn't show any effects, positive or negative, on DF average rates. But this isn't to say it didn't affect their academic behaviors. It did increase advanced math course enrollment in 10th grade, the year after the study. In an exploratory analysis, this is entirely consistent with our theory about why this is a relevant moderator. A school's resources can mean that sometimes a growth mindset makes the difference between excellence and adequacy, and other times it might make the difference between passing and failing. The second moderator was a cultural factor that specifically is relevant to growth mindset. That is the norm of a school's support for challenge seeking in the classroom. If students who learn a growth mindset are more likely to seek out challenges, but then run the risk of being made fun of by their friends because the norm in the classroom is to not try hard, then treatment effects might well be weaker. But when norms are unsupportive, they might be weak. And what we find is that when norms were supportive, there was a rather large and striking treatment effect. It was still substantively meaningful and significant in the unsupportive norm group, but smaller. And this moderation analysis identifies a priority for future intervention research, one focused on peer norms, as long as we can make a causal interpretation of this. So to wrap up, you might be thinking this kind of heterogeneity is unique to social psychological interventions, but I want to be clear, there's every reason to think that some of the most highly touted nudges, FAFSA simplification, O-power, all of which are typically talked about as main effects in cost-benefit analyses, are also highly sensitive to context. And I'm happy to discuss that in the Q&A. So I want to leave us with a couple questions. How might we lead the field to tout main effects less and be more upfront about the likelihood of heterogeneity in our effects? And then if we do so, how might we sample intervention sites intentionally to learn about contexts that drive heterogeneity in our effects, both to advance theory and also to help guide the field as they use our research? Thank you very much. It came from a big team of folks and lots of funders, and I'm grateful to all their support. Thank you.
All right. So the way I was thinking about a short talk is how about I take all the data out and you will have to believe me that I have the data backing up what I'm going to say. So I'm going to talk about intrinsic motivation. And think about it. Intrinsic motivation is possibly the best predictor of engagement, but maybe it's just a buzzword. And maybe it doesn't mean anything. Maybe intrinsic motivation is like when you use the word actually. It's just for emphasis. Just motivation predicts behavior, right? And it's actually motivation that predicts behavior. We think that the reason that intrinsic motivation is so misunderstood is probably because it is ill-defined, and probably because too often we use it in a meaningless way. We should think about intrinsic motivation as experiencing an activity as an end in itself. That is, the individual is motivated to to do something because it achieves the goal that it's supposed to achieve. There is a perceptual fusion between the activity and the goal that it serves. And we distinguish that from extrinsic motivation, which is the motivation to achieve some external benefits that are separated from the activity. So there is the activity and there is the goal or the benefits, and they will come at a separate time. They are perceptually separated. That means that basically any instance of goal attainment is by definition intrinsically motivated. If you do something that achieves the goal right there, you are intrinsically motivated. And the only question that we should ask ourselves is how much of a distance, physical, in time, perceptual, there is between the activity and achieving the goal. I believe that what I said now sounded reasonable. At least it sounded reasonable to me. And the only problem is that there are other definitions in the literature. There are the money definition that's often endorsed by economists, which means that there is a specific content that is intrinsic. And there is another content definition in psychology which identifies intrinsic motivation based on certain contexts. In particular, novelty, challenge, curiosity is what comes to mind. As I was preparing this talk, I have this feature on PowerPoint when it suggests you pictures that you could use, and this is what I got for intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, and I wanted to tell my PowerPoint, this is exactly what I'm saying is not intrinsic motivation. Okay? I argue that it is not about specific contents. It's not that grades, punishment, money are extrinsic. Money can be intrinsic if what I do is meant to achieve money and feels like I'm getting the money as I'm doing that. There is a bit of history to this confusion. We have self-determination theory, which was meant to distinguish between motives that are innate, things that we are born with, such as autonomy, versus things that we learn to want over our development. There is also the discovery all the way back in the 50s that animals explore the environment even if they are not offered a reward, which led researchers to believe that curiosity can be intrinsically motivated. And from there was the logical confusion to assume that intrinsic motivation is curiosity. Okay? If curiosity can be intrinsically motivating, that means that curiosity is intrinsically motivating. And that, in my mind, is just a confusion. Any motive can be intrinsically motivating. Curiosity is just one of them. That brings me back to our definition of means and fusion as what creates the experience of intrinsic motivation. And now we should ask what makes activity feel like it's fused with the goal. And there are at least 4 variables that we identified in our work. When you have repeated coupling, when you have repeated association, every time you pursue this activity, you experience the goal. That creates a sense of intrinsic motivation. If they are similar, if the link is unique, if you do this only to achieve that goal, that is intrinsically motivating. This is where the work on over-justification effect happens. If the goal is delivered immediately, it can be intrinsically motivating. And some of the empirical work that my colleagues and I have been pursuing is exactly on this last point. What we are showing is that if you pay people earlier, they are more intrinsically motivated. That is, they enjoy it more, they prefer to do it when they have other options, more than if you pay them later. And this is driven by this strong association between doing it and getting paid. So here's the empirical support. I bet that is very convincing for you. I have 9 seconds, so we should care, okay? Intrinsicality predicts persistence, whether it's New Year resolution, time spent studying, how long people were at the gym, how often they came over a 3-month period, consumption of healthy food. We measured it with green vegetables and carrots consumed. Intrinsicality can also increase persistence. We found that gym goers persisted longer when they chose based on enjoyment and than importance. Children and adults ate food presented as tasty more than healthy, and so on. So intrinsicality is important. It is something that predicts engagement. We should just be careful in how we think about this concept and better understand it. All right, thank you.
Hello. Today what I'm going to talk about is one of the challenges we have with interventions is that we administer intervention at a time that is temporally distant from when the behavior we're targeting occurs. I think of this as bridging time. So how do we bridge time? And specifically, I want to focus on using associative memory as a strategy for bridging time. And the way associative memory works is, this is a really simplified version. You see a cue, I proactively associate some concept with it. Here it's going to be the concept of associative memory. You see the cue, I want you, when you see this sign, think of associative memory. Okay? When you see this sign, think of associative memory. And that means that when you see this sign, you may think of associative memory. Okay, so the first project is a project with Katie Milkman with aliens, where we call it reminders through association. And the high level goal of this project was, how do you get people to not forget to follow through with something when you control the choice environment? And there are umpteen studies. I am just going to show the one field experiment. This is at a cafe called Crema in Harvard Square in Cambridge. And we stood outside, we passed out coupons that could only be used on Thursday. They get these on a Monday. And we say, remember to use the coupon. Half the participants get this, half the participants then get, the other half get this. Same thing, we just say, this alien is going to be on the cash register on the day that you can use the coupon. When you see the alien, think the coupon and use it, using associative memory. You remember the sign. So what we find, so then what we do is, the day of that Thursday, we put the alien in front of the thing, in front of the cash register. About a third increase in using the coupon. So the cue is always there, but the cue was not associated with anything for the people in the condition where they didn't know the alien was going to be. It's just a weird thing that they all probably noticed, but they don't know what it means. Whereas we conferred on it some kind of meaning, and it meant remember in this time, specifically in the moment when you can act on it, to use the coupon. A lot of other studies in this topic. What we find is, especially in an environment where there's lots of reminders, written reminders, the challenge is putting some kind of cue that is noticeable, unique, unfamiliar, where people notice, why is that there? And they remember. It's called reminders through association. The idea is, how do we bridge time from when we're intervening to when the behavior is going to be performed? And as choice architects, we might specifically put cues in the performance environment and then associate those cues with the behavior to make sure they're noticeable. Or as choice architects, if we know that there's going to be a cue, we might, or as people who are sophisticated and want to change their own behavior, we might do this proactively. The second application of using associative memory to bridge time is a project with Bob Cialdini and Jessica Lasky-Fink in politics. And so the idea is, people are often attacked. This is a real campaign that happened in, I don't even know, Bob. In Michigan in 2016. Gretchen Whitmer sends an ad saying that her opponent, I'm not sure, this attack goes out, okay? It's not an attack, excuse me. It is an assertion by Gretchen Whitmer that she is great on this topic. She's expanded healthcare. The rival sends this ad, which is clarifying. This is actually the response that the campaign uses. It is a response to a previous ad where it says Gretchen Whitmer has been great about expanding healthcare. It says she's owned by the insurance companies. Presumably, that's why she wants to expand healthcare coverage in Michigan. And so in the real campaign, there's a claim and then there's a response. It's an untrue claim. or an incomplete plan. So what we do is we try to associate, and this ad keeps being shown by the Whitmer campaign. So what we want to do is we want to associate this ad. Bob coined this phrase, it's the poison parasite. We want to parasitically attach the response to this to the exposures to this ad. So what we do is we take the image of the ad and we attach the response so that when they subsequently encounter this ad, they think of the response. The exposure conjures up through associative memory the actual response to the ad. Then they're repeatedly exposed in campaigns to the actual ad, right? So imagine a world, if you can, that one candidate dominates the news and a rival can't get any attention, but the one candidate is saying things hypothetically that is totally untrue. But you can't get in. And the rival and the candidate who keeps saying things, for example, keeps using the same phrases. If you parasitically attach to the phrase using associative memory, the phrase conjures up its own response. And we find across a whole series of studies that using associating with the response with the ad can be superior, especially over time, to actually just responding. Because then when the louder voice gets airtime, it carries with it its own response. So the big picture is when you see this sign, you think associative memory. And that we can use associative memory to bridge time. I showed two ways: reminders through association, which is using aliens like this, and the other is parasitically attaching to an ad so that when that ad comes up, it conjures up its own response, sometimes a self-negating response. Great, thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Edward Chang. I'm a fifth year graduate student here at Wharton. And today I'm going to be talking to you about a field experiment we ran to test, does diversity training actually change people's behaviors at work? So diversity training is ubiquitous in organizations. Most Fortune 500 companies offer some sort of diversity training to their employees, and companies often respond to incidents of bias or discrimination with diversity training. So for example, just last year, Starbucks closed all of their stores for an afternoon so that their employees could undergo diversity training after an incident in a Philadelphia Starbucks just down the street from where I live, where 2 black men were arrested. And even just yesterday, Sephora closed all their stores yesterday morning so that their employees could undergo diversity training because of a similar incident. But in spite of the fact that diversity training is so commonplace in organizations, they actually haven't really done any field experience testing. Does diversity training actually change people's behaviors? And so we set out to test this. So we ran a pre-registered field experiment. Our experiment involved just over 3,000 employees of a global organization. And we randomly assigned participants to either take diversity training we had created or control training we had created about psychological safety. The training took place entirely online. It took about 60 minutes to complete. In our diversity training, we first talked about the origins of stereotyping and categorization from a relatively cognitive level. We presented a variety of research that shows that stereotypes can negatively affect women in the workplace, highlighting some of the research conducted by people in this room. We had participants take an implicit association test, and they received feedback on the levels of implicit associations. We provided research-backed strategies about ways to overcome bias and stereotyping in the workplace and opportunities to practice those strategies. So we had a variety of different dependent variables. First, we measured people's attitudes. We measured attitudes immediately at the end of training via survey questions. We measured people's attitudinal support for women, whether they would personally acknowledge their own biases, and the responses on a situational judgment test, essentially saying how they think they would respond in different workplace situations where bias may arise. But ultimately, we cared about measuring people's behaviors. Did we actually see effects on behavior change? So we measured behaviors up to 20 weeks post-intervention. So these were all separated in time from the training itself. And they were also unconnected in the eyes of the participants to the training. So we worked with our field partner to establish workplace programs that were real workplace programs. So we're measuring real people's behaviors, but people didn't know that these programs were associated with the training they took weeks prior. So we measured who they were willing to informally mentor, who they chose to recognize amongst their peers for excellence, as well as who they were willing to volunteer time to help via an audit experiment conducted with all the participants. So I'm going to be presenting a lot of results to you really quickly. The way you're going to read these charts is there's going to be a blue dot, that's our estimated treatment effect size for each of these measures, and there's going to be a horizontal bar with error bars. Those are the 95% confidence intervals around these effect size estimates. And if the bars overlap the center lines, that's bad because it's a null effect. So first, we do find evidence of attitude change. So on all three of our attitude measures, these are overall treatment effects. We do find evidence of the diversity training changing people's attitudes. We also had pre-registered subgroups that we're going to analyze the data by. So we're looking at men and women and employees inside the US and outside the US. And what we find, particularly for this attitudinal support for women measure, is that really the biggest effects on attitudes we have were amongst those people whose attitudes were least supportive of women to begin with. If their attitudes were already strongly supportive of women, we don't see much effects on their attitudes. But for behaviors, we see a much less rosy picture. We essentially see null effects for all of our behavioral measures. And looking by these demographic subgroups, again, there's not much movement, with one major exception, which I'm going to dive into. So one of these measures was an informal measuring program. So this program happened about a month after the training was completed. And participants were told about a new workplace program where they could schedule coffee chats to foster inclusiveness in the workplace. So our measure was essentially how many women were being selected for this program in the treatment versus control. And this is just showing the overall treatment effect again. Again, there's no main effect of treatment. But when we break it down into finer grained demographic subgroups, what we find is that we do find this significant effect amongst women in the US. So women in the US are selecting significantly more women in the treatment versus control. But upon digging into this result a little bit further, what we find is that this is really actually driven by women in the US seeking out mentorship from more senior colleagues regardless of gender. So the biggest behavioral effect of our diversity training was actually seeming to cause women in the US to lean in and be more proactive about overcoming barriers in the workplace. The last behavioral thing I want to talk about is, do we see any evidence of diversity training to have spillovers to other demographic groups? So one of our diversity trainings was focused entirely on gender bias and gender stereotyping. And at least in the US for our behavioral measures, we could see, does the training focus entirely on gender? Does that also improve people's attitudes and behaviors towards racial minorities in the US? And what we found was that yes, it does. So for this informal mentoring program, we found that people who took a diversity training focused entirely on gender bias and gender stereotyping did choose more racial minorities in the US to informally mentor. And they also chose to recognize more of their peers who are racial minorities for excellence. So in general, I think our results suggest that these one-time diversity trainings that are pretty commonplace in organizations aren't really effective standalone solutions to combating bias and stereotyping in the workplace. But we do find some effects on attitudes, not really on behaviors. But the biggest behavioral effect we detect was amongst women in the US, seeming to prompt them to lean in to the workplace. And we did find these positive spillovers of a gender-focused training on people's attitudes and behaviors towards racial minorities. Thank you.
I've read a lot of your work. I don't know if I've read all of it. So I like your definition of intrinsic motivation. I wonder if, though, you have applied it to the most extrinsic of motivations, which is incentives.
Yes.
So if incentives are given in conjunction with the task, then
Yes.
they become intrinsic in the way that so they generate persistence.
Yes. So the key test for our model is to take money and make it intrinsically
Yes.
motivating, and so we did exactly that. We basically find that if you pay people earlier, they are more excited about what they are doing. They are more likely to keep doing it after you no longer pay them.
So it does generate persistence.
It generates persistence. Now, increasing the payment does not do it. Okay? And I can envision situations, I can create situations in which increasing the payment would actually crowd out intrinsic motivation. So we can replicate these effects. Yes, but this is when you add reward. So I was doing it for one reason and you change my reasoning for why I'm doing it. I'm taking activities that people are doing because they are getting paid. Okay? And either provide the payment immediately as they are doing it or later on and show that they enjoy it more, they are more engaged, they are persisting more when it's immediate. And sorry for using this word, it's mediated by this experience infusion.
Lovely.
A question on, I was really struck by your comment about what happens this time with the norms of positive and negative, that one example you gave. How often do you try to change that environment, like have a intervention to support your intervention? Is there any work you've seen that has changed norms at sort
I mean, I think that's the challenge. So at some level, people don't typically think about context moderators in ways that are predicted and where there's a plan to measure it before the study. And so even identifying a candidate for the intervention is one of the innovations. But then it's exciting. It's like, okay, well, norms. But then we're in the problem of how do you change huge groups of people? Before it was an individual person. I think it's going to be more promising to change norms at a classroom level. And so the study also surveyed all the math teachers. And what we find is that teachers with fixed mindsets have weaker treatment effects. Teachers with growth mindsets have really strong treatment effects, especially for students of color. And then we have natural language processing of the language. And it turns out growth mindset teachers are talking about the process, giving you the chance to revise from your mistakes. Fixed mindset teachers are doing things like discouraging low achievers from asking questions. And so if I'm a kid and I'm like, oh, challenge is great, I'm gonna make a mistake, I'm gonna learn something new. And the teacher has either a curriculum that's all right answers right away or discourages that, then it's hard for that behavior to translate. So the kind of intriguing idea is, what are kind of mundane education reforms about? Like a more open pedagogy that then get catalyzed by a precise treatment directly delivered to a person.
But a question for everyone based on that is, how often do we, instead of asking whether an intervention works or not, look at outliers to say what happened here? It didn't work for the group, for the intervention, for the arm, of whatever, but wow, something like interesting happens to these three people, what's going on contextually. I think contextualization is actually incredibly important. In your work, there's contextualization, there's kind of quantitative cuts and then there's qualitative cuts. How often do we look at outliers to say something interesting is happening, and then we can design an intervention based on those?
Yeah, the problem is we so often don't know if we can believe it.
Yeah.
And so planning ahead for a few predictions about places where you might not see it, and then have measures to find out if you were right or wrong, and then marrying that with the analytic discipline, like machine learning approaches that penalize for making lots of cuts in the data. That's the approach we decided to take as a first pass. Kevin, you had your hand up?
Yes, this is a follow-up question to all of you also about the context modifier questions. I think this is an incredibly important question for the field. Often you see these situations where there's a positive study and everyone wants to generalize from that study and say, well, this approach works. Or you see a negative study and then people say, well, this kind of initiative never works. And of course, neither are true. And I think most of the time, we're not very good at measuring context modifiers. We can focus on observable characteristics, which do have important modifying effects. But I worry almost more about factors we're not able to really observe or assess very cleanly, like the motivation of the staff at the organization that's implementing the intervention. And I'm wondering if you can each comment on how you try to think about those issues as you design and test ideas.
Yeah, I know you've thought on that too. I have a lot to say.
Yeah, we all have a lot to say, so I'll let you start.
So for what it's worth, I've been thinking about this in developing country context. There's a lot of programs we've been doing, fairly large-scale evaluations of up to like 20,000 people across the world that are doing a lot of caseworker work. And so that's a situation where we're dealing with individual workers at an NGO or government who are doing face-to-face life coaching and various things of this nature. And there's a lot of other programs that are like this, not just the ones we're studying, and very little attention is paid to the characteristics of these frontline workers and how that interacts with the efficacy of these programs. Instead we just say, it worked here and it didn't work here, and then people try to talk about why, what the differences are. And I think my hope and my instinct is that there's one level of heterogeneity is just right under our nose, and it's measurable, and it is about the actual interaction that's happening on a human level, and we just need to understand that interaction better. That's obviously tons of applications to your question, but that's the context that I've been exploring that is in your domain.
I will just give an example because I completely agree with your statement that we should understand the context and not overgeneralize. I would say that in studying intrinsic motivation, the one thing that we find again and again and again is that it predicts behavior more than extrinsic motivation. But then you have to remember the context. So I can get people to eat more veggies because they like it. I don't think that I can get people to adhere to a painful medical treatment because they like it. Okay? Or that emphasizing that you should think about the pleasantness of the experience is ever going to get them to do it. And understanding that also identifies that the set of situations to which this should not be applied, and I should think about other interventions.
At least for diversity science and diversity interventions in the field, I just think that there have been so few actual field experiments measuring actual behaviors. It's really hard to start talking about these context questions, and that we don't even have 5 or 10 field experiments conducted in organizations testing does diversity training really work. So it's really hard to answer that question. But one of the cool things about the experiment that we tested is that we did have 63 countries represented. We do have different offices for a single organization. And we do actually find an exploratory analysis really interesting, heterogeneous treatment effects. So I glossed over a lot, but essentially the largest effects on attitudes we see are on these people who's, I think, are maybe less familiar with a lot of the topics that we covered in our training. Like, it is kind of educational intervention, so people who know less about these topics are maybe affected more. But really the biggest behavior effects we see are people who are already bought in. So it seems like the diversity training in terms of changing people's behaviors are really people who are already primed to be predisposed to think about diversity training. And that's always what we see in our own sample. But it's hard to kind of generalize across contexts, and I think diversity science as a field is still very nascent.
I have 3 thoughts. The first is a reminder of where we are, I think, in the field. The second is sample and study design. And the third is, I think, some bright spots. People are doing well. The first is, for a long time, people didn't think that a light touch treatment directly to a person could change consequential outcomes, right? And it's kind of amazing that we ever saw any effects. And the context is in the error term in our experiments, right? As long as we assume random assignment. And now there are enough studies where it's kind of amazing the variety of ways to directly interact with a single person and see consequential changes in savings, behavior, grades over time. It's almost like we've forgotten that itself was a kind of absurd thing to think to begin with, given how embedded people are in broader context, right? So I'm trained in education. It was offensive to say that you could directly treat a student, given the massive inequalities between schools. And now there's been greater acceptance, I think, of psychological approaches. And because we're able to do things at scale, then we can actually come back to studying what was a legitimate response from the field, I think, for the initial experiments. The second point is that our samples are just not designed to learn in this way, right? So lots of replication studies that are done in kind of ad hoc haphazard samples, mini labs type things, are almost always designed to ask questions about, is the effect there or not? And the kind of is it there, isn't there approach is, I think, profoundly wrong-headed when we're talking about the complexities of human behavior over time. But it's also, I think, just bad science, in part because you're stuck with moderators that are post hoc, whatever you happen to measure after the fact. And so we can have massive sample sizes, but no way to accumulate knowledge. So I think what we can do is we can make a plan and maybe commit to a few things in advance as a team, and have, in some ways, adversarial collaborations in the moderation stage. And that's kind of what happened with the sociologists in our study. I thought the treatment would work better in places that were the least supportive, because I thought in the most supportive norm places, that they're already getting treated, the controls. The sociologist said, you're such a crazy psychologist. You believe in the individual. The context is going to win. So we pre-registered competing predictions. On the one hand, is the treatment like a drop of water in parched soil, or is it like planting a seed in tilled soil? And we let the data tell us which of these two, and we had a test that lots of people looked at. So I think the adversarial part of the planning phase could be done more deliberately. It doesn't always have to be random samples, but I think the complaint that random assignment was too hard plagued the field for decades, and I think the same could be said about random sampling, and I think we can do it more intentionally. The last is, I think, where I've seen Angela go with the panel is to plan ahead for moderators and regularly collect measures of things that could potentially be straight up to do experiments. And then and I'll let Todd talk about it, but what both OPower and Todd's work has done is to continually replicate in each new site, and then have microdata to predict. So I think there are examples of people that are thinking carefully, like Hunt Alcott's paper, I think, is a classic in this phase in 2015. So I think we're at a moment where it's time to start taking it seriously, and it's understandable we are where we are, but I think we can do better.
The Hunt Alcott paper is the site selection bias.
Yeah, 2015.
I mean, he's so prolific, we need to name the paper.
Yeah. Like whiskey.
Yeah. I've been a part of two different big bodies of field research, and the first one is this. I'll start with the most recent one, which is this basically OPower for student absenteeism, which we've now replicated in pre-registered applications in 15 districts with 250,000 families across 4 years. And despite that scale and daily attendance data, it turns out the intervention is super potent, about 100 times more cost effective than other next best interventions. It grows over time.
Todd, can you just say more? But I know
OPower, sending repeated mailers to families comparing their kids' attendance to their classmates' attendance and targeting key missed false beliefs. The first is parents underestimate their own kids' absences by a factor of 2. So correcting that false belief is really potent, and we're working on when social comparison can be useful in addition to that. But the intervention, super effective, grows over time. We have not found any reliable moderators of the treatment effect. Grade a student, and we only target lowest performing students, so we've already got a sense for the sample, but still the bottom third of every school district. Race, gender, grade level, free and reduced lunch status, language spoken at home, attributes of the schools. We've now involved over 1,000, probably like 4,000 schools. Super reliable and steady. I don't really understand it. It is a surprise to me. But the context doesn't seem to matter for that intervention.
Well, you haven't done the measures. Or you haven't done the measures.
Or we don't have it.
And
It was anathema. I should not have said, it was heresy to say that the context doesn't matter. We have not detected the context variables that undoubtedly do moderate the effect. But in the other body of work, which is get out the vote research, which I've been a part of this work for 15 years, there are probably 200 get out the vote experiments involving 20 million people. There is a moderator. The most important moderator is not a person or a situation, it's the person by the situation, which is it's the kind of person in a given election. And so it turns out that the best predictor of treatment effect of get out the vote interventions is there is a given voter's propensity to vote in that kind of election. So take primary election where turnout is 12%, the marginal voter there shows the biggest effect. Someone who has a 60 to, we'll call it a 50, 70% likelihood of voting. In a general election with 60% turnout, totally different group of people are the biggest treatment effects. And so it's the situation, which is the election type, by the individual difference, which is their propensity to vote in a given election. And so it's not even a stable attribute, it's an interaction between the two.
And the footnote to all this is, I've been in enough planning meetings with sociologists to imagine their disgusted faces of how how we've come to talk about context. I think they think a lot and very deeply about emergent properties of groups and of institutions that would lead to measurement ideas. And it's a real challenge when we have to rely on administrative data from districts. In education, that's what we often have to do too. The norm, there's no sampling frame nationally for norms for challenge seeking, right? I couldn't have stratified it. So I think the next phase is to expand and include people that conceptualize the context as a variable, and then think about a few places where we could design and deliver measures.